I'm going to make a Azorius Control matchup tier list for Season 33. I'm using Evening Child's tier list because it has more decks than mine. I'm going to spend a lot more time on the more popular decks, and the ones that I think have more depth to them. So I'm going to start with the more popular decks. Glimpse. I think Glimpse has like over a 60% win rate into Azorius Control, but I think it's actually pretty heavily favored for Azorius Control because you just counter everything. So I think it's a favored matchup. I don't think it's heavily favored because they can, if they draw Glimpse, they can suspend it and then cast their Discover spells in the same turn. You also do have to counter their large creatures sometimes. Alright, so Oops All Lands, similar to Glimpse, but more of a glass cannon. They just lose to a single removal spell in game 1. Then in post-board games, if they're on Calibrated Blast, they just lose to Ruined Halo. And if they're on the field, if they're in like the Aftermath Analyst version, which is like trying to play as a field deck, then they are essentially playing a worse field deck, and I think field is already a favored matchup for Azorius Control. So, like this just is less functional than the regular field deck, which is already a favored matchup, so I think it's pretty unlosable. Mono Blue Librarians, I believe this is the Honor-bound deck. This used to be even or even losing before I started playing Ruined Halo, but it's because basically the problem is you can't actually answer Stoic Sphinx if you're drawing off Librarian, because they just counter your counter spells or removal because they're more expensive on your end step. And when you try to Wrath, which is your only way to remove the Stoic Sphinx once it's already on the board, they just counter that even if you don't draw off the Librarian. But you can just play Ruined Halo and then you have both the inevitability. Well, you have inevitability and they just can't pressure you. So basically Ruined Halo just wins this matchup. I do have like a repeal and things, which can be annoying, so I don't think it's like completely unlosable. And it's possible that they can just counter every single win con you have. I've never faced someone who tried to do that, but since Approach is 7 mana, they can just counter it. They can just not let you resolve it twice. But no one has ever really tried that against me, so I don't know. This is the Azorius Ravens Warning control that also plays Field of the Dead. This is a losing matchup because... So I think they usually aren't playing Jace Memory Adept or Nezahal. Maybe they play Nezahal, but they don't usually play Jace, which is really good in the mirror. Nezahal is not that good, but Field is pretty hard to beat in a control mirror. And Raven's Warning is just good in a control mirror even if you aren't playing a good Witch board. So they definitely have the advantage, and they can answer Trawler and Approach with counter spells with Wraths for the Trawler. Like, you're never winning early with Approach. Mono White Humans. Boros Humans is not on this tier list, but that one is like slightly favored, I think. This one is going to be either heavily favored or just regular, moderately favored. I'll put it in heavily favored because they don't have burn damage and they don't have a way to stop Wrath other than Thalia. Blue Steel is a really interesting one. It might be losing. I can find a list. So this deck has, in the 75 they have 4 Thorns and 4 Lodestone Golem. And if they put some things in play and put like 2 tax effects in play, it's just over. Which is a high roll. They basically, if they high roll, they just win. If they don't, they just lose. They can use the reality chip. That's really hard to remove and it gets a lot of value, but post-board it does just die to Heliod's. It's basically entirely dependent on how much they high roll. So I think it's like even. I'm not sure how often they get like a double Thorn draw. I'll put it in even. I'm not exactly sure. Red deck wins. It's probably even, so they just lose to a trawler. And that's the entire game plan against them. But if Azorius Control doesn't have a trawler, then there's really no way to stop the damage from the burn spells because No More Lies falls off pretty quickly on like turn 5, and Out of Air is 4 mana. So you can't actually counter their burn spells once it gets that late. So yeah, it's basically just about can you trawler on 6, and can you do something before then. Soldiers, that might be losing. It's either losing or even. This is the M-Dog deck. Basically, they have Spell Pierce in the side, they have Slip out the back, they have 4 Boromirs in the 75. They have Thalias. And basically, they're just really good against Wraths because they have Spell Pierce, they have Boromir, and then they can just not go very wide. Like, they often can just hold a bunch of cards in hand and still be pressuring you. And like Pippin is really good against single target removal. Flowering is pretty good. There's actually no Benevolent Bodyguard in this list. I think that's different than normal. Like this, I think M-Dog used to play 4. Maybe not. I think this is around even though. It's a creature deck which is normally bad but has a lot of advantages over regular creature decks, so I think it's around even. Field of the Dead. I think I'm like 2-0 in this matchup. Basically, they can't beat Approach, and Wraths stall against their zombies for a long time. So I'll put it in favored, maybe it's slightly favored. It really depends on their list, but the list people have been playing this season definitely lose to Azorius Control. There's probably something they can do to make it favored against Control, but no one has done that. Aristocrats, I think this is favored. It's definitely close. I've played this from both sides, and I felt better from the Azorius Control side. Their combo is not that good. It is burn damage. So they have burn damage with Bombardment, but it gets stopped by Ruined Halo. Their combo still loses to Trawler usually. And basically they just lose if you resolve a Trawler. And otherwise they are a pop deck, which is annoying. Ruined Halo hits either pop or the Bombardment. But basically you just slam Trawler to win. And Wrath is not that good, so you kind of need to Trawler them. Though it doesn't have to be on turn 6, unlike against Red Deck Wins, which is why I think Red Deck Wins is a tougher matchup. Okay, so Orzhov Yorion. This is a losing matchup currently. It really depends on their list, because lists earlier in the season, I think, were losing to Approach, but Sakrator's current list is definitely favored against Azorius Control right now. It's kind of an aggressive deck, and it has 6 walkers. The walkers are really annoying because even Sorin is a must counter, and will kind of just take over the game. Not as much as Kaya. And it's also more aggressive than other lists, with like Luminarch Aspirant, Sarcomancy, Bunicorn. So it's harder to, like, it's better against Approach because you can just kill them before they approach twice as the Orzhov player. So it's really hard to win game 1 because you can't really beat Tithing Blade as the control player. And they have 8 answers to Wrath. So yeah, I think this is probably the worst matchup of the popular decks, by far. And it's actually the reason I haven't been playing Azorius Control much recently, because I don't think I can really beat Sakrator unless I change my list. So this is definitely the worst matchup. I think I will sort these in tiers. The further left it is, the better matchup it is for Azorius Control. I guess I'll take this off, but I'm not sure about these. Blue Steel is probably the best of these. This is definitely the worst matchup. Uh, what else for popular decks? The Rock. This is... So, black midrange is almost always bad against control, because they just lose the late game and don't have early pressure. So, they have Bob to gain value, they have Bats, and they have a Walker in Vraska, but it's just not... Vraska doesn't take over the game. Like, they don't even have to answer early because it doesn't really do anything. It just draws cards, kind of. And they just lose the late game. They can't beat Approach. They actually could beat Approach with Lost Legacy, I guess. But they still can't answer Trawler, actually. So yeah, this is just a really good matchup. Fires is potentially favored into Azorius control. It really depends on the list. A lot of them lose to Approach, I think, and some of them don't have enough must counters. Like, this deck only has Mastermind's Acquisition as a must counter, so I think Azorius control beats this list. And there's like this list, which has Seasons Pass and some walkers, which might beat control. And it has Lost Legacy to beat Approach. It really just depends on the list. So some lists are favored against control, some are not. Pirates, I'm not sure about this one. I want to say it's slightly favored. So it kind of plays like a tempo deck. So they have a bunch of cheap creatures, and then they also play Spell Pierce, they play Burst Lightning. They have Pop in the side. Their aggressive plan is kind of slow, which is why I kind of call it a tempo deck. I'm not really sure what advantage it has over, like, you know, Boros Legends or something, or like Red Deck Wins. I think I'll put it in the slightly favored. It's probably close. It's probably around the same as Aristocrats. I'm not sure. Cycling. So normally cycling is favored into Azorius control. But this season they lost their aggro plan because we lost Drannith Stinger and Valiant Rescuer. And Flourishing Fox is just not enough as an aggro plan. So the power of aggro slide in the control matchup is that they have 3 plans, and Azorius control has to answer all of them or they lose. Taking out an entire like, now they only have 2 because they just don't have the aggro plan. It's either Rift or Flare. And so basically, all control needs to do is destroy the Lightning Rift and counter the Flares. So I think it's definitely favored for Azorius control now. Might even be fairly heavily favored. Like, it's just so much worse for cycling now that they don't have Valiant Rescuer, because that was one of the most problematic cards in the matchup, because it was their 3rd plan against control, and now they just don't have that. This is Orzhov Auras. This matchup is extremely hard to lose, because they don't... They don't really have a way to beat Wrath. So even if they draw their entire deck, they just can't beat Wrath, and they're also really weak to single target removal. So they really just don't have a chance against Azorius control. So I'll put it as the best matchup for Azorius control other than Oops All Lands for now. This is Azorius Dorian. I'm actually not sure if I've played this matchup. I think I played it like once. So they kind of just lose to Approach, I think. Because They don't play many counter spells, and they don't have a clock, so I think they do just lose to approach. This is one of those matchups that would definitely beat Azorius Control if I wasn't playing approach or a bunch of trawlers, but this deck is just so bad into approach. Approach really just wins this matchup by itself. So I'll put this in favored. Gyruda is interesting. So some of them play the leyline that makes your creatures uncounterable. This isn't actually Gyruda, it's Heartless Summoning, mid-range kind of thing. They can't really beat Wrath. Wrath just deals with their entire board. But Dread Presence is really annoying. It is hard for Azorius Control to stop this. It's like exactly Path that answers it if they don't attack. And giving them a land is not good, since they're a lake deck. Oversold Cemetery is also annoying, because one of the main plans is counterlocking them, plus Wraths. If they play like Lost Legacy, I do think it's a lot harder for, because Approach kind of just beats them Wraths into Approach. But if they play the Leyline, it's definitely either even or favored for the Heartless deck. But if they don't, it's either even or favored for the Azorius Control deck. So I'll put it in even. Boros Legends, this is kind of like White Weenie, but with reach. It has pop, so this deck is not very popular this season. It's probably the best aggro deck into Azorius Control. They play like White Weenie, but they have reach, which is just kind of hard to deal with. It's kind of like Boros Humans, probably better into Azorius Control. They have a lot of haste creatures. So I'll put it in slightly favored, I think. Put it as the hardest matchup of the slightly favored decks. Maybe. Maybe not. Maybe it should be up here even. It might be even. I'll put it in slightly favored though. Okay. This is the Glimpse version that plays Shardless Agent and Pandemonium. It's similar to Glimpse. It's probably a little bit harder because they play more ways of getting Glimpse. And they play Ricochet Trap. So I'll put it around here. They do whiff more often, I believe. But it's a little bit harder than Glimpse, I think. Mostly because of Ricochet Trap. What's next? Emeria. So this plays Yorion. It's basically mono at Yorion, but instead of getting black, you get Emeria. So normally Azorius Control can't beat. Azorius Control just loses to the value of Emeria plus Yorion. But this deck can't really beat Approach. So, and like even Nevermore just gets removed. So I'd say this is heavily favored. Oops all spells, they lose to counter spells. They do have Silence and like Spectre Shriek, but it's still a deck that folds to counter spells. Simic Flash, I have no idea. Flash tends to be good into control in general, but I have no idea. This deck plays 4 Mystic Snake, 4... Simic Flash. So this deck plays 8 counter spells that are creatures. Those are annoying. I'm not exactly sure how annoying though. I haven't played this deck, and it's not very popular, so I don't know. I mean, it's a blue instant speed deck. Not mean to do that. So it has some game into the control for sure. It's probably favored for Azorius, but I don't know. Bunicorn, I'm not sure if this is Orzhov or Azorius. Uh, where is it? Okay, this deck is Azorius. I don't know if they can really get through removal because Unicorn and the Thingy Machikos both die to single target removal. Wrath is also pretty good against this. They do have Spell Pierce. So this deck is probably favored. I'm not really sure though. Bard class. So the deck... Okay, so the aggro plan is extremely easy to beat as the Azorius deck, because they're just a bad mid-range deck that just loses super hard. They basically can't win if they just play girl creatures. But if they play planeswalkers, they can potentially win. These walkers are pretty bad though. They don't like actually win if they go unanswered. So basically they need to Bard class, and Bard class is really hard to beat if they get to the third chapter. But there is enchantment removal in Azorius control, so I think it is favored if anything. Because if they don't have Bard class, their deck is terrible. If they do, then, I mean, there's enchantment removal. But otherwise, they do just win. So I think it's slightly favored. I'll put it here. Hardened Scales. So, this deck loses to Heliod's pretty hard. It loses to Wraths, I think. It's definitely better than White Weenie, but I think it's pretty bad. I'll put it in favored somewhere. I guess it's around here. Maybe it's tougher than Glimpse. No, probably not. Well, yeah, I'll put it here. Necrotic Ooze. So this is the deck that Merpady has played a lot, I think. Okay, this looks like... So no gifts. There's 4 Priest of Fellrites, 4 Buried Alive, 4 Lively Dirge, interesting. This deck is kind of an Iona deck, kind of a Ooze deck. This is probably a little different than the deck Merpady played. Okay, this deck has... Actually, I don't know what the difference is. This is probably favored for Azorius control by just countering the important cards. Priest of Fellrites is hard to beat, but you can just counter the Buried Alive. Don't really know. It's probably slightly favored. I have lost to Gifts versions of this, because Gifts is a lot easier to get under counter spells. If they get Iona plus Priest in the yard, they basically just win. But that's kind of hard to do when the Azorius deck can just counter the Buried Alive. Actually, I don't know if this is supposed to be Esper or Orzhov. Looks like it's supposed to be Orzhov, so I'll say it's favored. Okay, Clerics is interesting because they're really good against Wraths, but Path and Condemn answer the aura nicely. Not Condemn because they don't have to attack. And they do have Benevolent Bodyguard, which makes it harder to kill the aura. It's probably close to even. I haven't played this deck. I don't think it's very popular. Turbo Fog. So the Turbo Fog list this season plays Mesmeric Orb, as the win con, I believe. Okay, this deck actually... Okay, so the goal of this deck is solitary confinement to draw. So you basically draw both players a lot of cards, except you have Hall of Heliod's Generosity and Confinement to stop you from drawing cards while your opponent draws a lot of cards. The thing is, you can't actually lock Azorius Control out of the game when they have Approach, and this deck never beats Approach. Yeah, it's impossible to lose to this deck, because, well, they have Greater Auramancy, which means they can protect Nevermore. Okay, so they have to Nevermore the Approach, and play 2 Greater Auramancies. But you are drawing Azorius Control their entire deck, so if they have any way to win through all of your cards, then they just win. So yeah, I think... Like, you have to actually resolve Nevermore and then 2 Auramancies, so I think it's definitely... deserves to be up here. Hypergenesis, like Glimpse, but... bad. I don't know where to put this. Around there. Restore Balance. Not entirely sure what that looks like this season. I think I faced it like once. So Tezzeret is a must answer. So it should be noted that you can answer a Colossus or Gargadon after balance because the removal spells are 1 mana. I think this is pretty heavily favored. Like, you just counter their important cards. And their deck is hardly functional anyway because of the border post mana base. I'll put it in favored. Actually, I think White Weenie is not that good of a matchup. I'll put it down here. Hogak. That's the Insidious Roots deck. They kind of just lose to Wraths. I did lose to it once because my Wraths didn't stop regeneration, so I lost to Golgari Grave Troll with 2 Wraths in my hand. But I play 1 Fumigate 3 Wrath now with another Wrath on the side that stops regeneration. So I'll put it up here somewhere. Demir Tempo, they have Bob for value, but otherwise you just can't lose the late game and their early game just doesn't get there. I'll put it somewhere in here. Greasefang, I don't think I've faced Greasefang a single time this season, but it's actually fairly popular. They don't really play an actual fair plan other than walkers, which are annoying. There are must counters. You can kind of just counter the Greasefang, the Planeswalkers, and the Lively Dirge. But that is quite a few must counters, and they have, like, Bats. They have Lost Legacy. They have Silence. So I'm not sure. It's probably favored for sure, but I have no idea how much. Midnight Mass. That might be a bad matchup. Okay, it looks like it's not a Lightning Rift deck this season. I don't actually see how this beats Azorius Control. They kind of just lose to Bringer getting countered, I think. And Starving Revenant. They have Bats. With only 1 Lightning Rift, I just don't think they can really beat Control. Though it hasn't really been played. Okay, 3 Lightning Rift makes it a lot better into Control. Maybe it's around even with this list. But Approach is pretty good against this deck. They also... yeah, they kind of just lose counters, and Heliod's can answer that, but I haven't really faced it. I don't think I faced it this season, so I'll put it here. It's probably favored though. This is supposed to be a mono white hate bears deck, which is like mono white aggro but slower and with some blink spells. I don't know, it's probably slightly hard. They play Boromir, so it's slightly harder to beat than White Weenie, I guess. Orzhov mid-range. Without Yorion. So this deck is not even blinking anything, I think. It's just an Orzhov mid-range deck with Bob, with walkers, with removal. This kind of deck is terrible into Azorius control, but they do have Kayas. So it's not that bad. So I'll just put it in the bottom of favored. And then Abs and mid-range, so it really depends on the list. If they play a bunch of walkers, it could be close to even, otherwise it's pretty heavily favored. It really just depends on the list, kind of like fires. So that is my matchup tier list. As you can see, I don't really think many decks actually beat Azorius control. Red deck wins, maybe beats control, maybe any of these four do. So maybe there are like 5 decks that beat it. It's possible that Pirates beats it, Boros Legends. And like Fires potentially beats it. Like Seasons Past piles maybe beat it. But otherwise, I think this deck is pretty hard to beat outside of exactly Yorzhov. I think if you want to beat it, you play Sakrator's version of Yorzhov. I think this is the one deck that very clearly beats Azorius control. It is possible that a Raven's Warning version of control would beat that, but I think Raven's Warning is pretty terrible this season. I think it loses you a lot of games that just playing Trawler would win. So this is my matchup tier list for Azorius control, which I still think is the best deck in the format, but maybe I'll play Yorzhov and I'll think that's the best deck in the format. But I don't know, I think the best 3 decks are like a tier above everything else. I think they are Azorius control, Rakdos Aristocrats, and Yorzhov, not necessarily in that order. And then below that there's like Glimpse, and then everything else. Yeah, this is my matchup tier list for Azorius control.